This is Lisa Henderson, editor for Applied Clinical Trials, and I'm here today with Cynthia Hahn, Research Compliance Officer for the Feinstein Institute for Medical Research and a team member for the use of central IRBs for multi-center clinical trials for CTTI, which is also known as the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. At the DIA annual meeting this past June, Cindy presented on some of the CTTI updates in this area, and she's here today to give us an overview of central IRBs and clinical trials. So, Cindy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
There apparently has been hesitancy among certain stakeholders to use the central IRB for multi-center trials, and I was wondering if this was more prevalent among academic medical centers or institutions than with sites or institutions that sponsor with pharmaceutical industry?
Sure. No, that's a great question. So the pharmaceutical industry is clearly interested by the use of central IRBs in order to improve the efficiency of conducting trials. And in addition, I think there's some very real and concrete support for central IRB models that's been established by the federal regulatory agencies, whether we talk about FDA guidance in 2006 or OHRP's advance notice of proposed rulemaking from last July. So I would say that industry and many in the regulatory community are leaning towards a more streamlined review process. I'm not sure there's hesitancy and that the hesitancy is more prevalent at academic medical centers. The sample for our individual project contained academic medical centers, universities, and research institutes. So definitely things we would define as institutions. And we didn't really look at physician offices or research offices. That said, the challenge for academic medical centers is in a way the same challenge that any organization experiences when trying to change or improve a process. So what we found is that the individuals and organizations were hesitant to change because there were so many unknowns. When it wasn't clear that there would be a beneficial impact on their current operations, and yet they were being asked to take apart a process which most of the organizations we spoke with believed that they had represented as a best practice. So they thought their system was so good, why would I change it?
Right. And we see from your slides and what you just said that there are clear positive regulatory positions for using a central IRB, and in your slides the initiative states the definition of a central IRB, and then you spent some time now uncovering the barriers, which are also listed, and there are quite a number of barriers. So I wonder if you could elaborate on what you and the project team are doing about addressing the barriers.
Mm-hmm. So the first barrier we actually identified is one you just referenced, which was the fact that we really had to define the term central IRB because there's very little consistency in the use of the term throughout the country. So we had to take a step back and actually consider the definition, and recognizing that there were many models out there, such as facilitated review, where it's a shared review process between two IRBs, federated models, which are consortiums of IRBs that work together to review something, and then central IRBs. And by central IRBs, for our purposes, we're really looking at a single IRB of record for an entire project, so that there would be no other IRB review at any other institution. And essentially what we did was we conducted interviews with 25 stakeholders at 6 research institutions that do not routinely use central IRBs, and we thought it was important to get to that group. So these are people who had indicated to us that they did not use central IRBs and had not adopted any central IRB model. And we really needed that group because we wanted to obtain feedback on the proposed solutions. These research institutions all have their own IRBs and were purposefully selected to be diverse with respect to the volume of their clinical research, so a good mix of federal and industry-sponsored research, and their geographical location. And the kinds of people we interviewed are people like IRB chairs, administrators, institutional counsel, vice deans for research, directors of trial offices, or other individuals responsible for making decisions regarding the use of IRBs. And we got some pretty diverse viewpoints back. We held these discussions, and then we held an expert meeting with diverse stakeholder groups and thought leaders to kind of walk through the solutions. And essentially the barriers fell into 3 very broad categories. There were legal and regulatory concerns, administrative concerns, and quality of review concerns. But what was very interesting is that no matter which bucket the concern fell into, the common theme emerged was that many of the perceived barriers related to conflating the responsibilities of the institution with the ethical review responsibilities of the IRB. So what was really happening here was that most or all of the tasks related to protecting the institution are often coordinated through the institution's IRB office and incorporated into their review process. So at many institutions, what had originally evolved as sort of a bureaucratic convenience, locating certain institutional processes within the IRB office seem to have altered many people's conceptions of what is actually required and entailed in the ethical review of research. So they really had confused these two issues of institutional and IRB responsibility. So what we did was we developed a tool, which essentially was a list of considerations that institutions and IRBs need to consider when entering into a relationship. And what we said is that this consideration document, that these are the kinds of things that need to be documented in a reliance document or an IRB authorization agreement when an institution agrees to rely on an external IRB. And they include things like developing plans within the agreement that address the communication of unanticipated problems or noncompliance, so that was like a legal regulatory concern, to the reviewing IRB sponsors and regulatory agencies. So who actually does the reporting and how does it get done? Or who handles things like conflict of interest disclosure, management, and reporting? And the idea behind that document is really to provide a communication between the institution and the central IRBs. Because the other theme we heard was this idea of trust. So the second major theme to emerge from our interviews was a feeling of discomfort with an external entity handling the ethical review and oversight of a multi-center project. Institutional stakeholders frequently made use of the words comfort and trust. So they would say, well, I'm not comfortable, or I don't trust, or how can I become comfortable? What does that mean for me to trust another IRB's review? And the issues really appear to be influenced mostly by an institution's prior experience with using an outside IRB. So if an institution had utilized an outside IRB, they were much more comfortable doing it again. And while accreditation was important, it was not sufficient to alleviate these concerns in and of itself. So the data suggests that experience, not simply increased knowledge, is necessary to allow institutional stakeholders to feel more comfortable with central IRB review.
That's very interesting, even about the accreditation and then how their IRBs evolved internally to take on those dual roles. But do you believe there will be a cultural shift for these institutions to adjust their levels of comfort and trust in a central IRB?
So I think a cultural shift is required in order to allow a central IRB model to succeed nationwide. Right now, there's very little motivation or incentive for institutions to defer IRB review to an external IRB. And because what we found that we just spoke about, that institutions' comfort level with the use of central IRBs was proportional to whether or not they had any prior experience, those with little to no experience using a central IRB appear to be more hesitant to accept the model. So it's sort of a chicken and egg situation, right? If institutions don't use central IRBs, they're less comfortable with central IRBs. But if they use central IRBs, then they're comfortable. So how do you get them to actually start to have faith in the process? And while industry does request use of central IRBs, they don't mandate it. And institutions are naturally sort of skeptical of why, the industry partners trying to look for a central IRB review. But what we noted is that NIH actually can be a partner in this process because they've been making some inroads here by pilot testing projects like the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke's NeuroNext network. That's required use of a central IRB in order to be part of the network. So in order to be part of that network of researchers, you have to use the NeuroNext IRB. So in this situation, NIH and other government sponsors should consider requiring the use of central IRB review for some multi-site trial networks. In that way, these relevant stakeholders will then be able to gain experience that will inform their levels of comfort and trust. Because without having them actually use a central IRB, there's very little incentive for research sites to overcome their feelings of discomfort. And so that's a real cultural shift.
Well, thanks, Cindy. Is there any other things you wanted to add about what you may have discovered or things that you think you can do to help shift this experience level?
So I think one of the key components here is really going to be the considerations document. We are going to publish that information within the next couple of months. And I think that once we have that considerations document out there and people start thinking about it, I think one of the next key developments is really for institutions to start thinking about what a real robust IRB reliance or IRB authorization agreement looks like, and for people to start thinking about templates and the kind of agreements that would work across multiple centers. Because once you have that information and people are comfortable with the communication plan and they feel as though someone has a trusted partner, I think it'll go a long way towards the adoption of a central IRB model.
Excellent. You'll have to send us the URL for that,
we definitely
that document when that becomes available. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.